Okay, well, thank you very much for the introduction and also for the opportunity to be here this evening with you and to talk about forgiveness and how it's related to mental health. It's a pleasure to be here and an honor to be able to share this talk with you and to be able to talk about forgiveness and the great power that it has in the context of health and mental health in particular. As excuse me, as was mentioned, I have a contract with Routledge to publish the book that you see on the bottom right of your screen, and it actually quite literally was released on May 31st. And so I actually have one of my free copies right here. So it's kind of exciting that it actually just was released in the last couple days. And so part of my talk will be focused on some of the material that is in my book. I'm going to talk about mental health. If we can go to the next slide. Okay, thanks. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about mental health in general, and then with a particular focus on addiction and recovery from addiction. The other image that you saw on that first slide was Dr. Worthington's recently released second edition of the Handbook of Forgiveness. And part of my talk also is based on a chapter that actually Dr. Toussaint and I wrote, focused on mental health as well. And so, in addition to the slides, which I understand are going to be available, if you're interested in reading more, kind of specifically about what I'm talking about, there's a chapter in Dr. Worthington's book, and then also material in my book as well. Now, I'm not really trying to pitch my book to you in the sense of, trying to get you to buy it. I'm just trying to let you know where the information is. And actually, if you contact me, I have my email address at the very end. I'll be happy to talk more specifically, answer any questions you might have, and help you actually get in touch with some of the access maybe to some of the material that I'm talking about. And so as you can see here with the overview slide, I'm going to talk about a lot of definitions and then how forgiveness the mental health generally, how forgiveness is related to addiction recovery more specifically, and then brief research overviews, and then also close on talking a little bit more about Dr. Worthington's REACH model of forgiveness. So next slide, please.
Sorry, I'm not getting it to go over.
Keep moving to the right.
There we go. Is that the right one?
Yes, thank you. So what I always like to do whenever I give a talk on forgiveness is to start with a couple quotes and have you just kind of have those in the back of your mind as we're talking. And as we get to the end of our discussion, I'll bring those quotes up again. But this first quote here from Martin Luther King Jr. Back in 1964, this is actually a part of his acceptance speech of the Nobel Peace Prize. And he said, "There is a sort of poverty of the spirit which stands in glaring contrast to our scientific and technological abundance. We have learned to fly the air like birds and swim the sea like fish, but we have not learned the simple art of living together as brothers." And then Gandhi said back in 1931, what is true of individuals is true of nations. One cannot forgive too much. The weak can never forgive. Forgiveness is the attribute of the strong. And so I like to always open with those quotes, as I mentioned before, and just have you have those in the back of your mind, thinking about those as we talk about some of the different aspects of forgiveness and mental health. Okay, thank you. So first, I think a good question to ask, even before we talk about forgiveness in terms of how do we define it from a psychological science point of view, is just the simple question of what is forgiveness? Is it a secular thing? Is it a spiritual thing? And sometimes, in scientific circles, people start debating whether it's one or the other. And obviously, in some scientific circles, being a non-spiritual thing would be better. Others, people are open to spiritual things in science. But my argument is basically that it's both. It's a secular thing and a spiritual thing. And spirituality is a very important contributor to many facets of physical and mental health. And it's clearly, I think, people easily see that forgiveness is a spiritual or religious type of idea, or at the very least has its roots in those areas. And psychology is coming around, science is coming around and recognizing forgiveness in the context of positive psychology, or a human strength and virtue that potentially all human beings can benefit from. And so just a couple more brief points before I get into some specific definitions about forgiveness, just to stress from Dr. Toussaint's talk last night, and also Dr. Worthington, whenever he's teaching about forgiveness, there's a distinction between the emotional aspects and the decisional aspects, and it's very much an emotional process to forgive, talking about the steps of forgiveness, which we'll briefly touch on at the end. But it's also part of Dr. Worthington's REACH model is a very explicit aspect of making the decision to forgive. In fact, forgiveness is viewed as a choice, something that a person willfully chooses to do. Now, we can get into kind of subtleties about that choice, and sometimes, depending on cultural background, religious background, people may sort of interpret religious teachings to the conclusion of, yes, I must forgive, of course I forgive. And so in a way it becomes less of a decision, but sort of something that religious belief compels. And yet it's interesting, I would argue that in those kinds of situations, perhaps sometimes people believe that they've forgiven when they actually haven't. And so it's important to understand that distinction between the emotional process, all of the things that go on involved in forgiving, but it's also important to understand that there is a decision process, a choice process, and even if a person strongly feels that forgiveness is very important to do and I need to do it, there's still a choice aspect there, and it can't, in many ways, it cannot be compelled. Forgiveness is also a multidimensional issue. Again, this has been spoken of before, but I'll just touch on it briefly. The idea that that forgiveness can be a trait or something, excuse me, that somebody kind of typically does in, most, if not all situations. But it can also be a state, where somebody's individually forgiving a particular circumstance. And sometimes, for example, people might have high levels of trait forgiveness, or they typically forgive, but there may be situations where they have a struggle to forgive. So I think it's important to think about those kinds of dimensions of forgiveness. Also, other types of dimensions: forgiving others, forgiving self, feeling forgiven, seeking forgiveness, and so on. And so the first couple definitions about forgiveness that I want to share, a few years ago with colleagues, we were actually working on trying to bring some scientific consensus to self-forgiveness. Feeling like reading through the literature, the scientific literature, that there wasn't really a clear, concise definition of self-forgiveness. And so we were trying to review all of the literature where different scholars were talking about what self-forgiveness means. And one of the things that we observed was that there were many different points being made about forgiveness in general, and that it seemed like there was a core idea of what forgiveness is that could then be used to build upon for particular other dimensions like self-forgiveness. And so this first definition here arguably is what colleagues and I concluded on from the literature about what it means to forgive just in general, regardless of whether you're talking about other forgiveness, self-forgiveness, seeking forgiveness, feeling forgiven, etc. But the general idea of forgiveness is such that it occurs over time and is a deliberate, volitional process involving a fundamental shift in affect or feelings, cognition or thoughts, and or behavior in response to negative feelings regarding an acknowledged offensive experience without condoning, excusing, or denying the transgression, and at a minimum, an absence of ill will toward an offender. And so in general, that's kind of what forgiveness means. But if you think about self-forgiveness, particularly, if you go to the next slide, there's some differences with self-forgiveness that are important to point out. And one of the most critical differences is, let's see, I think we're going to the next slide. Yep. Okay, thanks. One of the most critical differences with self-forgiveness is the idea of reconciliation. Oftentimes, when we think about forgiveness, we think about repairing relationships. But strictly speaking, forgiveness does not necessarily include reconciliation. Again, oftentimes people want to reconcile when they forgive, but they are two different issues, especially easy to see, I think, when we're thinking about forgiving other people. I can forgive you, horrific offenses, but that doesn't mean I need to still be friends with you, and have our relationship go back to exactly what it was before. And so reconciliation is not necessarily a part of forgiving other people. But when we're thinking about forgiving ourselves, we have to reconcile with ourselves. We cannot, end our relationship with ourselves, even though we might want to forgive ourselves like we can with other people. So self-forgiveness has some distinct qualities based on some differences involved with the self. The easiest to see is you have to reconcile yourself. You can't avoid yourself. If you're avoiding yourself, that's a whole nother issue related to mental health. So the definition of self-forgiveness. Self-forgiveness occurs over time. So again, it's sort of building on that other general definition of forgiveness as an idea. Self-forgiveness occurs over time and is a deliberate, volitional process initiated in response to one's own negative feelings in the context of a personally acknowledged, self-instigated wrong. One of the issues there is sometimes people say, well, if you're forgiving yourself, aren't you really just letting yourself off the hook, not really being accountable? And so this is part of that definition, clarifying that it's our own negative feelings in the context of our own personally acknowledged, self-instigated wrong that results in ready accountability for that wrong and a fundamental constructive shift in one's relationship to, reconciliation with, and acceptance of the self through human connectedness and commitment to change. So self-forgiveness involves some, specific issues related to having a relationship with yourself going forward. You can't avoid that. And then also not letting yourself off the hook. Okay. Now, transitioning a little bit before we talk about some of the models of how forgiveness is related to mental health and so on, I want to step back a little bit and talk about how health is defined. And actually, this is the quote from the World Health Organization defining health. Dr. Toussaint mentioned this yesterday in his talk, and I'm going to mention it here, quoting it. I love this definition of health: a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and critically, not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. And so health, and I think it's, it applies whether we're talking physical, mental, or social well-being. Health is not just reducing sort of negative symptoms, but increasing positive aspects of life. It's not just getting rid of disease or infirmity. It's an all-encompassing approach to well-being. Okay, next slide, please. So mental health, let's talk about that. How do we define mental health? The American Psychological Association, they actually have, I don't know if I have it handy, they've put out a dictionary of psychological terms. And one of those terms that they've formally defined is mental health: emotional well-being, good behavioral adjustment, relative freedom from anxiety and disabling symptoms, and a capacity to establish constructive relationships and cope with the ordinary demands and stresses of life. Now, another term in there to define is well-being. So if you go to the next slide. Well-being, again, as defined by the American Psychological Association, a state of happiness and contentment with low levels of stress, overall good physical and mental health and outlook, or good quality of life. Now, if you go to the next slide. And so one of the things that I've done in the Handbook of Forgiveness chapter that I referred to at the very beginning is kind of put these definitions of mental health and well-being together and termed it general psychological adjustment. And so again, the American Psychological Association defines adjustment as a well-adjusted person is one who satisfies needs in a healthy, beneficial manner and demonstrates appropriate social and psychological responses to situations and demands. And so all of these things kind of fit into what we're talking about when we're talking about mental health. And if you'll go to the next slide, thanks. And how forgiveness is ultimately related to mental health. So when we're thinking about forgiveness and trying to understand how it's related to mental health, ultimately, those definitions are what we're talking about, the ways, the impacts on health and well-being that forgiveness can have. If you think about those broader terms, a well-adjusted person, et cetera, forgiveness is related to many aspects of those definitions of mental health. Now, the general model trying to explain how forgiveness is related to health, before we talk about some of the research supporting it, is that there is a direct relationship to health, including mental health, between forgiveness and health, mental health again. And this direct relationship is it's really, if you really get right down to it, it's another indirect relationship, kind of through the stress of life. And Dr. Toussaint talked about that some yesterday. But it's kind of that the relationship between forgiveness and stress and health, or stress and health, is so intertwined and difficult to break apart in meaningful ways that we view forgiveness as kind of directly related to health by having an impact on reducing stress. But more distinct kind of intermediate variables, indirect variables that forgiveness has an impact on, which in turn impact our health, is things such as health behavior, social support, and interpersonal functioning. And basically what that means, again, is that the more forgiving a person is, it's thought that it leads to better social support, which in turn is related to better health. Similarly, more forgiving a person is, the more they engage in healthy behavior. And part of the way this is also explained is that when we're struggling with unforgiveness and the anger and the hostility and those other negative emotions, again, that Dr. Worthington talks about frequently and Dr. Toussaint spoke of yesterday, when we're sort of consumed with those negative emotions, we have much less energy to engage in healthy behavior. And so if we can forgive, it frees up energy to engage in more healthy behavior, and thus leading to better health. So when we talk about health behavior and healthy behavior, things like stress management, things like eating a healthy diet, exercising, all of ideas and aspects of health behavior become much easier to engage in if we're not consumed by all of the negative emotions and ruminating on the offensive experiences that we've had. Okay, so if you'll go to the next, okay, thank you. So a brief research overview of forgiveness and mental health. I think it's interesting to look at it from a historical perspective. 1947 is when the very first peer-reviewed scientific journal article was published. And there's actually 3 of them published in that year, and they're all basically kind of focused on forgiveness, sort of in the context of being this spiritual, religious kind of issue that could be helpful. And so again, the very first scientific publications came out in 1947. So between 1947 and 2018, 71 years, about 714 scientific articles were published. Now, it's been about 3 years since I combed through the data to figure this out. And so there's probably, to be consistent, on the average output over the years, there's probably maybe 850 or so articles now. But going back historically, if you'll go back just a quick second, thanks. Yeah, so in the through 2011, which was the year that the last prior to this chapter that I'm talking about, where we updated the broad literature review. So in the first 64 years, there was about 334 articles published. But in the next 6 years, there was about 380 published. So you can see that it took, decades to get basically that first half of the total publications out there. And then in the next 6 years, the next half was published. And so all of that to say that there has been quite an uptick in the activity and productivity of researchers in the context of forgiveness and mental health in the last few years. It's become a very popular topic in the psychological literature. Okay, if you go to the next one. So back in 2015, a meta-analysis was published looking at all of the research in the context of self-forgiveness and mental health. And self-forgiveness was consistently found to be associated with better levels of each of these symptoms and issues that I've listed there. And so psychological well-being, life satisfaction, general mental health, anxiety, depression, anger, guilt, shame. So, and there's potentially, when you look at the individual studies, there are many, many, many different mental health, well-being, psychological adjustment related outcomes that self-forgiveness specifically is associated with. Similarly, on the next slide, a meta-analysis published in 2013 looking at forgiveness of others in several countries. That first meta-analysis, most of those studies were in the United States. This meta-analysis in the context of forgiveness of others was looking at several countries, different countries, and an association was found generally overall between forgiveness of others and well-being. And so when you look at the literature, almost everything in the context of mental health that forgiveness has been researched, examined to see if it's related to better mental health. In almost every instance, it has been found to be related. So it's consistent and it's robust in that regard. Now, I want to switch a little bit over to addiction in particular, and I'll speak a little bit more specifically about some particular studies. But one of the interesting things about forgiveness and addiction recovery is that the lay mutual help community, so the 12-step model or Alcoholics Anonymous, where it originated. So within the lay mutual help community, among scholars, among public policymakers, over the years, all of these people in these different contexts have agreed that forgiveness is likely a critical factor in addictive behavior, and more specifically in the context of recovery. But only until maybe the last, I think the first study in this context was 2007. And so it's a very young field but there's a lot of promising research, and we'll get to that in a second. But one of the first things I want to do is talk about the societal burden of addiction, particularly in South Africa. And so this is data that I pulled from the World Health Organization. They collect this type of data for some 185 countries throughout the world. And actually, if you're interested in where I got this data, if you'll let me know, I can send you the links. And it's freely available online. But based on data from 2016, and South Africa's population being about 56 million in that year, AUDs in the slide there stands for alcohol use disorders. DUDs stands for drug use disorders. And so every year, over 725 people within South Africa are dying from alcohol use disorders, from a diagnosable disorder. Every year, 131,000, over 131,000 dailies are lost. And daily stands for disability adjusted life years. And so what it's getting at is time lost due to poor health and early death. And so every single year related to alcohol use disorders, 131,000 dailies are lost. Again, dailies, disability adjusted life years lost, 131,000 years. Over 900 deaths per year related to drug use disorders, and over 144,000 dailies are lost. And one of the points I want to stress here is that these are diagnosable disorders. This isn't alcohol use, it's alcohol use disorders. So if you look at just use, problematic use, those numbers go way up. There's over 3 million deaths every year across the world just related to alcohol consumption, not rising to the level of disorder. Now, when I talk about addiction, I also include suicidal behavior, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But within South Africa, again, from data from the year 2016, there's over 6,450 deaths every year by suicide, and over 320,000 dailies lost every single year. And so the toll of addiction, whether related to substances or suicidal behavior, is huge. And so I include suicide, if you'll go to the next slide, I include suicide when I talk about addiction. And sometimes people might wonder, well, why does he do that? And so clearly suicide can be a consequence of addiction. It can be comorbid with addiction or occur at the same time, but is it an addiction itself? And so different scholars have talked about addiction as a micro-suicidal behavior, but others have also talked about suicidal behavior as addictive behavior and developed theoretical modeling and observed scientific empirical support that the process of suicide, what people are experiencing in that struggle with suicidal behavior, is consistent with addictive behavior. And if we go back to the 12-step model, like Alcoholics Anonymous, it has been adapted in the context of suicidal behavior. In fact, I've got a link there, as you can see, for Suicide Anonymous. Now, Alcoholics Anonymous is, has a large presence in the United States as well as different countries in the world. I think Suicide Anonymous has recently started in the United States, so I don't think it has kind of spread to other parts of the world. But there's definitely a way to think about suicide as consistent with the process of addiction. So I include that whenever I talk about addiction and in the context of forgiveness and its relationship to addiction recovery. Okay, if you go to the next slide. Thank you. I just want to quickly talk a little bit about diagnosing addiction. In the context of the DSM, or the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which is very consistent with the ICD system of diagnosis. There are 11 diagnostic criteria for a substance use disorder and actually gambling disorder. It is the only behavioral addiction that's included in these diagnostic systems. But there's 11 diagnostic criteria, 2 of which are needed for mild severity, 4 for moderate, 6 for 11. Okay, so you need 6 of the 11 to have a severe diagnosis. And the other side of that is you only need 2 of the 11 or only 2 of the 11 are physiological in nature, so tolerance and withdrawal. You know, the classic issues of why alcohol or heroin or other opiates or other substances are so problematic because of the physiological problems. And yet severe diagnosis can be present without any physiological components. And I think that's important to think about. Again, going back to that World Health Organization definition of health, it's an all-encompassing approach to health. It's not just getting rid of symptoms, so to speak, but there's much more to it than, especially in the context of addiction, there's much more to it than just the physiological issues. Okay, next slide, please. So defining addiction, the essence of addiction is that it's an experiential relationship. Experience is the currency of addiction. When a particular pattern of behavior reliably and robustly changes emotional experience, the potential for addiction emerges. Addiction is the description of a relationship between organisms and objects within their environment. And if we'll go to the next slide, Charles Darwin, kind of a famous quote of his, said that an American monkey, after getting drunk on brandy, would never touch it again, and thus is much wiser than most people. And so if you'll go to the next slide, actually, I got ahead of myself a little bit. That last slide, I want to just mention that, and again, this all for me ties into this World Health Organization definition of health. When Darwin says that, after getting drunk on brandy, would never touch it again, and thus is wiser than most men. So the implication there is that there are reasons why people drink or struggle with a particular addiction. And so when we bring forgiveness into it, I would argue that just as there's reasons why people struggle with the addiction, there are reasons why people struggle with recovery. Addiction is a very difficult experience, and recovery is a difficult experience typically. And so there's different expectancies or different motivational types of issues that come into play when a person is struggling with addiction and similarly struggling with recovery. And I argue that forgiveness is one way to address some of those difficulties in the struggle for recovery. Okay, if you go to the next slide. Thanks. And here is a classic kind of example or a statement about that ties into these motivational expectancy types of issues. I don't know if you're familiar with the rock band Alice in Chains, but their former lead singer, who died from addiction, heroin addiction, talked about how at the end of the day or at the end of the party, when everyone goes home, you're stuck with yourself. And so to the extent that addiction is the struggle with interpersonal or intrapersonal types of issues, and when we talk about the 12-step model of addiction and recovery, one of the fundamental issues is developing resentments, which lead to addiction and lead to the struggle for recovery by having to address resentments. Forgiveness can be a very powerful tool in addressing those resentments. Okay, if you'll go to the next slide. This is a sort of a busy diagram of how forgiveness is related to addiction and recovery in a theoretical sense. And some of the research is testing these different relationships. But again, the basic idea is building off of Worthington's model, and that this is a particular aspect of health that we're talking about. And so similarly, the argument is that forgiveness is directly related to less addictive behavior. And in this case, as I mentioned, through resentment. So directly helps with recovery by addressing resentments. If we forgive people, ourselves, others, for the resentments that we're developing in the problematic relationships that we have, that can lead to better outcomes. But it also can operate through different variables like health behavior, social support, something that a term we've coined called existangst, which is a philosophically driven negative emotions like depression and anxiety, questioning our meaning and purpose in life and really struggling with those things. That is another distinctive intervening variable. If you'll go to the next slide, I want to get to some of actually skip forward a couple slides, please. Next slide. Okay, so here, back one. I want to leave some time for questions, so I'm going to go through some of the research pretty quick here. But one of the things about forgiveness and substance and behavioral addictions, so things like sex addiction, shopping, potentially internet addiction, those sorts of things. To date, there has been 51 studies conducted explicitly focused on forgiveness and how, excuse me, how it might be related. And so as you can see there, over 85% show a beneficial relationship. A few of those studies, 9, report a deleterious association or not beneficial. And so it's important to figure out what's going on in those studies. But the vast majority have shown that that forgiveness plays a meaningful role in recovery outcomes, better recovery outcomes. Similarly, in the context of suicidal behavior, 36 studies. Now, in both contexts, this is not a lot of studies, so we're very early on. But as you can see, the research is very promising. Over 85% in the context of substances. Suicidal behavior, 100% of the studies to date have shown a healthful effect. And in both contexts, multiple dimensions of forgiveness have been looked at. forgiveness of self, forgiveness of others, forgiveness of uncontrollable situations, feeling forgiven by God. And in both suicidal behavior and substance-related issues, many of these dimensions have been shown to be related to better outcomes, but very interestingly, forgiveness of self has been most consistently associated. So all of them have been associated, but most consistently it's forgiveness of self. And then also, interestingly, in some studies, looking at levels of forgiveness of self versus forgiveness of others, etc., forgiveness of self has been observed to be the lowest. And so putting that together, we've made the argument that forgiveness of self appears to be the most important, but also potentially the most difficult to accomplish. And that ultimately, when thinking about forgiveness in the context of addiction recovery, forgiveness of self may be critical to the extent that it may not be possible to have full recovery without forgiveness of self. Now, we're not saying that forgiveness is the one and only answer to recovery, successful recovery, but when you're thinking about the relevance of forgiveness and recovery, it looks like forgiveness of self is probably the most important. Okay, I want to end there. Actually, the rest of the slides are kind of a little bit more detail, and I do want to, if you'll skip, okay, that's all right. I was going to go to the reach slide, just to kind of touch on that model of forgiveness again. Worthington's reach model, standing for recalling, the offensive experience, recalling the anger, the hurt, all of those negative emotions. I think it's just a few slides ahead, if you can get there. Next one. Yeah, so, back one. Sorry. Yeah, this one. Okay, so that reach model that Worthington developed, and as Dr. Toussaint mentioned yesterday, it's one of the most researched models of forgiveness, very well established, very supported by the science as being an effective model or method of forgiveness. And so that the first issue there is recalling an offense in vivid detail, not excessive, but accurate and honest detail, developing empathy, whether for yourself or for the other offender, choosing and deciding forgiveness as an altruistic gift, something that is not deserved, but freely given, willfully and chosen, making a public and formal commitment to forgive and holding on to the progress. And one of the things that Worthington talks a lot about in those last two aspects of the model, the commitment and holding on, is facing and addressing the doubts that are inevitable. Forgiveness is a difficult process. As Gandhi mentioned, if you want to go to the next slide, it's something that you have to have strength to do. And in our culture, I think worldwide, sometimes, and maybe it's changing, but sometimes people view forgiveness as kind of a weakness. Oh, you're sort of giving in and not addressing the situation. But when you go back and look at all of the definitional components, it's a difficult thing to do, and it's a struggle, and it takes time to do. And so part of that doubting process in those last two steps of the model, explicit attention, deliberate attention is given to facing the inevitable doubts that come. Was it the right thing to do? what's going to happen if I forgive? Did I really forgive? Has it really worked? And it's a process that takes time. And the last quote I want to share is that one from Mark Twain, a famous author in the United States. Forgiveness, back in the 1800s, he was around. Forgiveness is the fragrance the violet sheds on the heel that has crushed it. And with that, I'll go ahead and end, and I think we still have a few minutes for questions.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Webb. Thank you, John. Really appreciate that. That was most insightful. And we do have some questions in our chat box. I'm going to moderate those. The first question is trait forgiveness genetically or personality derived or both? So is trait forgiveness a genetic thing, or is it, nature, nurture? Is it that upbringing thing, or is it a bit of both?
That's an interesting question. I think I'm not aware of any sort of directly applicable genetic studies. I know that actually Dr. Worthington has done a lot of, and some others that he has worked with on his team have done some physiological types of studies, and I think made some genetic types of arguments. But I'm not aware of any study identifying any sort of genetic component, explicitly. But I think it has to be probably a little bit of a combination at least. I think some of it, I think the easiest thing to see is probably a nurture component, growing up in a family, in a culture, in a religious community, perhaps, where forgiveness is highly valued and sort of adopted in that way. I think it becomes, there's very much an environmental component. We've learned, been conditioned to do it in certain ways. And so I think some people, if you took a group of 50-something-year-olds like I am, that haven't had any formal training, like, attended any kind of webinar like this, there's going to be different levels of trait forgiveness. And I think it's likely that that's related to some inherent, things that have been learned over the course of a life from early childhood forward. So I think there is that component, but I do clearly, research also shows that people can be taught to forgive. So, a person never exposed beforehand can be taught through programs like Dr. Worthington's REACH model can be to forgive. The research supporting his model is very clear that going through that educational process increases forgiveness levels of the participants that are doing that process.
Thank you. I think that kind of answers the next question. Is trait forgiveness something everyone can learn and practice, and how? And you've just indicated that one of the tools is using the REACH forgiveness model, the do-it-yourself workbook, which I know is in the region of 2 hours. And as we heard last night, you don't have to do all the 2 hours at once. You can space it out. But I know in that model, you choose a specific incident that you want to work on forgiving, and then you would go through the process of that. And so it's not like you're going to lump it all and try and get it all done at once. It's one incident at a time. So another question we have is, how important is the step of speaking out forgiveness to a person in the process of forgiveness? Is it something you would recommend that if you've been hurt by someone and you forgive them, should you go and tell them? Is that wise or not?
Excuse me. I think I would answer that question sort of yes and no. It's important, yes and no. And the first sort of thought that comes to me is in the context of the 12-step model of addiction and recovery, and the steps 8 and 9, which have to do with making amends and essentially making amends when appropriate. And so actually, if you read some of the my chapter in my book about how forgiveness relates to the 12-step model, I talk in way more detail about this. But basically, the 12-step model, when somebody's making amends, makes the argument that of course it's important to talk with and reach out and discuss with the people you're trying to make amends with, face to face, in person. That is important to the process. But they also make the argument that sometimes it can be more sort of destructive than helpful. And so the idea is to make amends when appropriate, when it doesn't cause more problems than it solves. And so I think it can be a similar kind of process in the context of forgiveness. We can, forgive people without ever telling them. If we want to reconcile, it often becomes important to talk to them about it. But I think the two processes can be separate. Forgiving somebody and telling them we've forgiven them don't necessarily have to happen together. I think it's very helpful to do it, but if it's going to cause more problems than solve, I think that's, something to think of and weigh, in the balance about whether we want to talk about it with the person.
Okay.
And then, of course, kind of a related issue, if somebody has died, we can't talk to them, although we could potentially through, spiritual means, through prayer, etc. But sometimes we have to work through that. We're forgiving somebody, but we can't, have that direct impact on the relationship. And that's a whole nother level potentially to have to address in the process.
Okay, thank you. We have an interesting question here in that someone said we are decluttering and selling up, which has forced us to confront boxes and boxes of stuff left by my spouse's parents who have passed on, plus past failed businesses. How do you suggest I encourage my spouse to move on and forgive oneself of failed relationships and businesses, to move on to a new start when we actually move in about 6 weeks' time? Now, I'm just going to help you there. I don't think there's a counseling session, so it's just a brief 1 or 2 pointer will suffice in this situation, just to assist this person.
Yeah, I think probably the two biggest things that I would encourage, right off the top of my head right now, and it's consistent with Worthington's REACH model, is the idea of recalling or acknowledging the difficult experience that you're having, not denying it, but acknowledging it and being open to sort of having that experience. And then the empathy aspect, trying to understand what happened with the failed business or with failed relationships, understanding, my role, understanding other people's roles, and understanding that it's part of that empathy response is understanding that these things happen, not to deny it, not to overlook it. That's the recalling the hurt part, but increasing understanding and acknowledgement that they're common experiences that people have, and that can sometimes take the edge off and help kind of cope with the overall difficult experience. One of the other things actually that I would encourage is to go to Dr. Worthington's website. And I imagine he's probably sharing it in his talks. But if somehow it's needed, all you have to do is Google Ev Worthington and REACH, And one of the first 2 or 3 links that you'll bring up are his websites. He has a university-based one and then a personal-based one. And he offers all sorts of resources for free that you can download and kind of learn about these processes. And one of the very good things, one of the things that makes it different from some of the other methods out there that have been researched as well, but with Dr. Worthington's resources, he has written them in such a way that you do not have to have a background in, science, or you do not have to be a therapist. They don't have to be used by a therapist with their clients. They're totally and absolutely written and designed for, the everyday person on the street to be able to utilize. And the 2-hour thing, is fairly brief overall, but you can also, break it into sections. Part of what it is there's a lot of exercises in his materials. There's some reading, to kind of get an idea and understanding of concepts and such, but there's a lot of exercises to complete that facilitate each of the steps of forgiveness. So I would encourage you to and anybody to access those resources.
Okay. Another question: when forgiveness is religiously compelled, how does this impact the individual emotionally, as the process is not volitional?
Yes, I think that's a very important question. And one of the first things that makes me think about is it ties into some of the data out there. So generally speaking, forgiveness has been observed to be a very, influential, useful, beneficial thing in the context of mental health. And this relates to when it's compelled, religiously, for example, what kind of issues are potentially there. Now, one of the things that we found in the data looking at forgiveness and suicidal behavior, again, forgiveness of self seems to be very much related to better suicidal behavior related outcomes. But one of the things that we've seen a couple times now is that forgiveness of others is actually related to more suicidal behavior. And so I think it ties in here to this question of when it's compelled, whether religiously or not, it can potentially be problematic. And so in the idea of, in the context of suicidal behavior specifically, more forgiveness is related to more psychache, which is kind of an aching soul, some of that existential, existential kind of idea about depression and anxiety and meaning in life and that sort of thing. So forgiveness, we've observed a couple times, forgiveness of others is associated with more psychache, which is associated with more suicidal behavior. And so I think the way that kind of ties in is when we feel like we have to forgive, maybe we're not ready to forgive, but we sort of otherwise go through that process, and it can create more tension and more problems if a person's not ready to forgive and not choosing to forgive, or kind of forgiving and overlooking things rather than genuinely forgiving, I think can cause potential problems. So I think in the context of religious issues and being compelled that way, I think we need to be very careful to, even though we're respecting the religious value, so to speak, to still work to ensure that it's happening voluntarily rather than a compelled kind of way.
That's good. That's good. What are some of the impediments to forgiveness? And is there a time limit to forgiving yourself or others?
I think I would say as far as the time limit goes, I would say there's not a time limit in the sense of we shouldn't feel pressure to get through the process and make sure, we're doing it in a timely way. I think the process can be very difficult, and so we need to be patient and let the process work and sort of have faith in the process. And so I think in terms of time limit, we shouldn't kind of put pressure on ourselves to make it happen. We need to it's a challenge and we need to work hard at it. But if we haven't forgiven, in a week or something, I don't think we should let that bother us. And in fact, what research shows is that forgiveness takes time, that it's not an all or nothing process, that it's not necessarily a linear process. The steps in the various models, people can sort of go back and forth, sort of like 2 steps forwards, 1 step back, maybe in some cases. And so I think it helps to understand that and take some of the pressure off in terms of a time limit. And we can make progress. And I think Dr. Toussaint talked about this a little bit yesterday, feel like we've made a lot of progress, and we probably have, but then some little thing happens and we realize we still have more work to go. So it's definitely a process that we should not feel is limited by time or feel the pressure of time on.
Yes.
Impediments to forgiveness, sort of the other side of this, and again, Dr. Toussaint touched on this yesterday. Some of the major predictors of whether forgiveness is going to happen or not are empathy, relational closeness, apology, those types of things. So the other side of that is if a person is struggling with empathy, it's going to be an impediment to forgiveness. If it's not a particularly close relationship, forgiveness is, I think another way to put it is forgiveness is probably not going to be as much of a priority. And so that could be an impediment. It may be more of a challenge in a way to forgive in cases where there's not a lot of relational closeness to begin with. And that's kind of a motivator. If it's like with my partner, my wife, forgiveness is in some ways more of a motivation. There's more of a motivation to forgive based on everything else we have invested in the relationship. So that's going to make it easier potentially. Of course, there's other things in a marital relationship that make it harder to forgive because there's a lot of expectations of, faithfulness and fidelity and those sorts of things. But also apology can help. But if there's no apology, then that can be an impediment to forgiveness.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to prevent it, it just makes it harder.
True. Thank you so much for that. I saw there were 2 more questions, but we are running out of time, and I don't think they're critical for the discussion for tonight. Thank you so much, Professor Webb. We really, really appreciate your input. Learned so much. I've already had some requests. Please, can we get his notes? There's so much to go through, and we want to revisit it, and you've already sent it. Thank you so much for that. We really appreciate the time and effort you put into preparing for tonight, the time in presenting, and helping us understand those concepts of forgiveness, self-forgiveness, mental health, well-being, the difference between decisional and emotional forgiveness, the REACH program. Those are very important things, and we thank you for the time that you took to share tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. It's been a pleasure and an honor. And again, I think my understanding is you're going to share the slides. My email address is in there. Please don't hesitate to contact me if you have any other questions or you know, need assistance in getting some of these resources. I'll be happy to do what I can to help. So please feel free to contact me.
Thank you very much, sir.